Hello folks, we're down the line once again from Boston tonight with political author, analyst and historian Dr. James D. Boys. I'm Michael L. Roberts. This is the American Chronicle.
So, supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that has him in check, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant, where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me.
It's Monday, 27th of April, 2020. And with thanks as ever for your support for this series, we continue tonight to ride the waves of air, not only on YouTube, but also now rather excitably via Spotify, Google Podcasts, Anchor FM and more, and with a forthcoming slot in the not-too-distant future on Apple Podcasts. Tonight, in light of, or in darkness of, if you will, the sounds that you just heard, we find ourselves analysing a week of presidential communications that will live in infamy. The story surrounding the hold-up of a further $500 billion stimulus package, the ongoing efforts, or lack thereof, of Democrats to occupy a comparative sliver of wall-to-wall Trumpified airspace, and much, much more besides. Here then, in so egregious an hour of history, is our interview. We heard some clips at the top of the show there, clips that have caused parody headlines to become reality headlines. What, if anything, has reopened in those states seeking to end their lockdown? And your analysis thereafter, please, of the moment the US president publicly explored the notion of injecting bleach into the human body, and suggested thereafter that such comments were mere sarcasm.
Well, it's almost difficult to know, where on earth to begin. The Trump presidency really is becoming beyond satire. If you would ever imagine that you would have had an American president suggesting that the American citizenry begin trying to bleach themselves from within, if you will, it would be a step too far for any satirist, quite frankly. We were almost in an era in which satire is just defunct, quite frankly. And you're seeing, I think, shows like Saturday Night Live desperately trying to stay relevant and stay afloat with regard to this. We saw last night in the US Brad Pitt play Dr. Fauci in the opening cold opening, attending to, I think, Dr. Fauci's secret desire to be played by Brad Pitt, quite frankly. A remarkable piece of satire, which is well worth a look at. The challenge you've got is that 4 years ago, Trump's supporters said, if you take him seriously but not literally, suggesting that the media were taking him literally but not seriously. How on earth you're meant to define between taking someone seriously or literally when he suggests, ingesting deadly materials is quite frankly anybody's guess. The problem is you're starting to see people who are being admitted to hospital for having done just that. They have listened to the president and they've gone, oh, that's a good idea, and have ended up, in hospital, where, of course, if they survive ingesting, deadly fluid, they could very end up being exposed to the very virus that they probably thought they were trying to avoid in the first place. It really is this bizarre secular manner of virus, presidential statement, followed by some sort of a reaction. Where this goes next is anybody's guess. The president has been doing these press briefings on a daily basis, lasting anything up to 90 minutes. But following the backlash against this suggestion that Americans somehow either end up using ultraviolet light from within or bleach from within. The backlash against that has been such, frankly, that the White House has, by all accounts, now said overnight, well, enough's enough. It's not worth the time and the effort if the media is going to misrepresent everything the president says. Well, of course, the media is broadcasting this live. It's not being edited. It's not being cut to pieces to show the president saying things which are demonstrably untrue. The media is broadcasting what the president's saying. And he's now, of course, turned around and said, well, I was being funny. It's like, well, okay. At what point would that have been ever funny is debatable, quite frankly. But when you see the number of American deaths now and the suggestion that he was being sarcastic, even suggesting at one point to a particular journalist, well, I was being facetious to you, and the journalist was like, well, I wasn't even in the room. We've also had a bizarre situation where, and again, it's interesting how often Trump singles female reporters out for this. The White House was trying to get Caitlin Collins, the CNN White House correspondent, moved from her front row seat in the press briefing room to the very, very back. Trying to get the Secret Service involved in getting her moved, only to be told, quite frankly, well, it's not the president's position to be moving journalists in that room. It's the White House, the White House Correspondents Association, who are responsible for the seating arrangements, which I'm sure sat very well with the president. He's now tweeted out overnight some bizarre tweet making reference to Nobel Peace Prize winners in media, not Nobel, suggesting that they've been on the wrong side of history and should give their prizes back. Well, I'm not. If you're out there, Mr. Nobel Prize winning organisation, then by all means claim your prize back. But I think that the Nobel Prize winning journalists can probably hold on to theirs, if for no other reason than they can at least spell, which apparently is one step ahead of the American president.
And in terms of what's opening up on a state-by-state basis?
You're seeing a variance across the states. Some states are saying, well, we can start allowing necessary entities to start reopening. Of course, what that means from state to state varies greatly. One of the greatest challenges that I don't know whether much is getting made of this, quite frankly, is going to be the weather. Initially, the Trump administration said, oh, that's right, the hot weather will kill the virus. Well, I don't know. I'm no more of a medical doctor than our esteemed president, quite frankly, so who knows? But what is going to have a huge impact on this administration is the weather. And the weather here is starting to pick up. Here in Boston, the weather is mixed. The old joke here in New England is if you don't like the weather, just wait 5 minutes and it'll change, which is as true as ever. But as the weather picks up, the more you're starting to see people defying the stay-at-home orders and flooding out onto the lovely Boston Common across the road. That's here in Massachusetts. In Florida and California, the beaches are starting to be filled up. So the challenge that each governor is going to face is, quite frankly, the better the weather starts to get, the more people are going to start defying these stay-at-home orders, which is going to make an ass, quite frankly, of those orders. So I think there's going to be increasing pressure because of the weather and also because of the increased longevity of people being asked to stay at home. They'll do it for so long, but I think eventually just start to think, well, this is ridiculous. I'm all right. The weather's beautiful. We've been doing this for 4 weeks. How long am I meant to do this? Let's get out and enjoy the summertime at last. If it rains, it rains. People stay inside. But the longer the weather improves, I think it's going to be a major problem trying to get people to remain indoors.
Mm-hmm. In a year and indeed a week of remarkable news, we hear limited mention of an extra $500 billion stimulus package to aid the American people, but also talk of a hold-up to the processing and release of that package. What's the hold-up?
The problem you've got now is that politics is becoming increasingly prevalent. It's raising its head. Not only were there challenges within the Senate in particular in terms of trying to get this legislation together with both the Democrats and the Republicans trying to bring together various aspects of policy requirements to bolt onto this document. But now the president himself is talking about trying to delay the release of the funds. And one of the areas that he's focusing upon, bizarrely it might seem to many people, is the US Postal Service. And he's talking very much about trying to basically make sure that the Postal Service massively increases its costs of sending packages in the mail, for example, suggesting it's being taken advantage of by the likes of Amazon and other delivery services, the like of which I'm sure many people can imagine. The challenge here, though, is why might he be doing this? Well, there's no love lost, of course, between President Trump and Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, who, of course, is doing phenomenal business at this point. Certainly over here in the United States, you're seeing Amazon doing great trade. So much of what it's selling online is selling out, whether it's home fitness material, whether it's podcast material, whether it's books, DVDs, CDs, you name it. That's going to date me, isn't it? Who buys CDs? Well, me these days. You get my gist. The idea that people are sitting at home, I think they've been grounded for 4 weeks, and they're running out of things to do. And so they are turning to Amazon in particular and ordering stuff at a particular rate of knots. And of course, the US Postal Service is delivering this stuff, raising Jeff Bezos's personal wealth, irking President Trump clearly. It's also worth considering whether this has something to do with the November election. We've talked about this idea that there are fears, which may be based upon conspiracy theory, but enough people are raising them to warrant discussing it. The suggestion that maybe Donald Trump is going to try and cast some aspersion over the result of the presidential election in November, if it happens and if he loses. One of the ways that clearly that is already being set up is by casting doubt over postal ballots. And of course, that would be in part dealt with by the US Postal Service. So it seems that the greater doubt that President Trump can cast over the idea of postal voting, by extension the Postal Service, the better, quite frankly, for his election campaign, which is quite frankly up and running. And one of the reasons I think you're seeing frustration in the White House is because there were great hopes that these daily press briefings would act as a form of presidential rally over the television. And I can assure you, if Donald Trump thinks he's getting shortchanged by the US Postal Service, he's more than making up for it with basically 3 hours worth of campaign advertising every night on every network as the TV channels carry his unedited discussions to the American people. What is notable, however, is how those have clearly backfired, and you're starting to see that in the polls.
In the mix of the press briefings there and the element that Trump as the great showman in his own mind is starting to fail in that capacity, to what extent are Republicans starting to distance themselves from Trump as a result of these briefings, and to what extent does that play a part in why the briefings are being cut back?
So the president's campaign for re-election was going to be dependent upon lots of large-scale rallies around the country. Clearly that hasn't been able to occur because of the virus situation. So to get around that, they've, I think, hit upon the novel idea of having a presidential press briefing every night, which no network is going to turn down. This, of course, plays into Donald Trump's own personal self-image of someone who is a great communicator, someone who he believes can convince anybody of anything if he's given enough access to the airwaves. 4 years ago, you saw him get an awful lot of free advertising by phoning into places like Fox News and MSNBC and Morning Joe with Joe Scarborough, for example, and basically you can get and say, what do you want to say to the American people today? And of course, he would wax lyrical about this, that, and the other. And all of his competitors will be scratching their heads saying, wait a second, this is ridiculous. He's getting free airtime. And he's managed to do so again with this use of the nightly sort of TV broadcast at the press briefing room. The problem, though, is this. There is an old adage which is, if you want to get someone into trouble, just put them in front of a microphone and let them talk, because they'll talk themselves into trouble. And we've clearly seen that with Donald Trump over the last week. He has long said incendiary statements, but they have sort of attracted as many people as they have repelled historically. what you've seen him start to do now is to stray into areas where he clearly has no clue whatsoever. And he might well sort of preface this with, I'm not a doctor, but, but when you start suggesting that people should ingest poison and, bleach and acid to try to cleanse themselves from within, this is taking snake oil salesmanship to a whole new level, quite frankly. As a result, not only have you now seen what may be a temporary or permanent suspension of these press briefings by the president and who knows by his advisors as well, but you're starting to see Republicans across the country get very wary. They're not at this point necessarily coming out and speaking against the president and saying, well, he's an idiot, what's he doing? But what they are starting to do is to run away from Donald Trump and try to focus upon local issues and anything other than the president, because as long as they're having to talk about what Trump is suggesting the American people do to themselves, the less they're able to talk about whatever is actually important to the American citizens in that state, wherever that might be, quite frankly. So you're starting to see a shift, I think, within the Republican Party, who only a few weeks ago, quite frankly, I think were convinced of two things. A, that they would retain the Senate. B, that they would retain the presidency with Donald Trump being re-elected, and that they would have a pretty good shot at a couple of extra House seats. None of that no longer seems to be the case. There are increasing concerns that amongst the Republican Party that they might well lose control of the United States Senate, and Donald Trump's re-election is no longer as assured as perhaps it was just 3 or 4 weeks ago. If you look at the historic upturn in unemployment, if you look at the downturn in the economy, this was a president who ran for office and spent 3.5 years of his term as president boasting about his ability to be a great businessman, to increase American wealth, talked about the idea that if Hillary had been elected, the American economy would have been in the tank and unemployment would have been through the roof. Well, guess what? That is exactly where we are now, 6 months prior to an American presidential election. It's unprecedented. It's very desperate. It's difficult to say that you can blame Donald Trump for some of this, but he's president, and he was quite happy to take all the praise for 3.5 years. So now, too, I think there's a recognition that he's going to have to take responsibility for what happens in the last 6 months of his term in office. So we'll see, but very, very clearly, the coronavirus has had a huge impact upon the president's re-election campaign and also the campaign strategies of Republicans who are running for office or running for re-election around the country come November.
Turning now to the ever-fading news surrounding the US presidential election this year. Are the Democrats doing enough to take on Trump? And how is Joe Biden managing to cut through this wall-to-wall Trump media coverage?
So, very clearly politics has re-emerged this week. For the last several weeks, there's been very little news except the coronavirus and its impact upon American society. I think that with the recognition that the Trump campaign might be in trouble, you're starting to see the re-emergence of politics as usual across the land. That's manifesting itself in several ways. I think politics has impacted the ability to get this new stimulus package through Congress. Clearly, President Trump has his own political issues with regard to it. You're starting to see, I think, Joe Biden struggling to make any headway. If this had been any other year, of course, he would have been out about meeting and greeting and holding rallies and raising monies. What he's having to do is to compete with the president from his own basement, effectively, trying to get the word out to raise funds. It's a little difficult to judge the success or failure of that because, of course, it's being so targeted to individual members of the Democratic Party, to donors, for example, that it might very well be that he's reaching the very people he wants to reach and it's being very tailored. What you are not seeing, however, is Joe Biden on the television. He's public face is simply not there at this point. Indeed, quite frankly, the only reason Joe Biden is being mentioned at the moment at all in certain circles in the American media is because of the re-emergence of certain allegations about activity that he may or may not have engaged in when he was a United States Senator several decades ago. And a tape has resurfaced apparently revealing the mother of an alleged victim talking to Larry King about how her daughter could maybe get her story out there. So that is hardly the kind of press that Joe Biden or the Democrats want at this point. You're also seeing questions being asked about who might be his vice presidential pick. He's made it very clear he's going to select a woman. And of course, therefore, various women are being touted around as being a potential running mate. Stacey Abrams out of Georgia has actually put herself forward, and there's been a big piece in The Atlantic about why she believes that she should be the vice presidential pick for Joe Biden. It really is quite extraordinary that someone would put herself forward in such a manner, quite frankly. I remind listeners that once upon a time, American presidents themselves didn't even run for election. They stood for election. And there is a distinction there. You stood for election, you didn't run for it. It wasn't an office that you were meant to seem to want. You were willing to put your name forward and stand for the people to vote for you, but you certainly didn't actively seek the office. That, of course, has changed massively, but the idea that now people are actively seeking and campaigning to be the vice president really is stepping things up quite a lot, and I think it's going to backfire upon her. We'll see, but I would be very surprised at this point if she ends up being the vice presidential nominee at this point.
Yes, within the Democrat context there, are the Democrats doing enough in terms of their election efforts against Donald Trump? And are Democrats as a whole presenting a unified front, if you will, behind Joe Biden, various vice presidential maneuvers aside?
So the one thing that Joe Biden has going for him, quite frankly, is that the Democratic Party and its individual members who were seeking the nomination this year appear to have either A, depending upon who you listen to it, listened to the advice behind the scenes of former President Barack Obama and fallen in line to back Joe Biden, or B, they've looked back to what happened 4 years ago and realized that the longer they keep their hat in the ring and diluting the anti, in this case, Trump vote, obviously the anti-Bernie Sanders vote in this case, the longer it is that their nightmare would have come to fruition and a potential Bernie Sanders candidacy emerged from the Democratic primary season. Now that hasn't happened, the Democratic Party at least can convey a unified image based around a moderate candidate. This is actually the nightmare for the Republican Party. The Trump re-election campaign was being geared up solidly to talk about the manner in which socialists had hijacked the Democratic Party, nominated Bernie Sanders as their leader, and you would have seen a scorched earth policy, I think, going after Bernie Sanders and the politics of the left, just as Nixon had done in 1972 against George McGovern, for example. Now that they can't do that and that the left has been effectively silenced along with, frankly, the rest of the Democratic Party, it becomes very, very difficult for Donald Trump to point to Joe Biden, who I think most people think is just a relatively bland, mediocre, centrist Democrat, and go, look, he's a dangerous socialist. Simply never going to happen, quite frankly. So you're going to end up with two old white men in their 70s running for the most powerful office in the world, quite frankly, and great questions about whether either of them would be able to survive and endure a 4-year term in office. So one of the great questions is going to be asked about, well, who's going to succeed these individuals if and when they ever become president, which takes us all the way back to the vice presidential question for the Democratic Party, of course.
Time once again, then, for my favorite part of the American Chronicle, historical context time. And tonight I'm thinking how I've heard you speak before on the theory that the quality of political leadership and political leaders during their time in office is often viewed subsequently in light of those leaders that followed them in the role. George W. Bush followed Bill Clinton. LBJ followed JFK, and Trump, of course, followed Barack Obama. How does that latter fact there influence our reading of Obama's 2 terms in office?
So, what I mean by this theory is the way in which a term in office is viewed subsequently in terms of the strength or weakness of whoever follows that leader. One of the classic examples from British political history is Margaret Thatcher. Whatever you think of her politics, and I realise that many people will disagree with her as agree with her in terms of her politics and her policies, her strength and character and resilience, the Iron Lady image, if you will, is, I believe, that much stronger. Not only because of the leader that she succeeded, i.e. the Labour Party and the Winter of Discontent and Jim Callaghan, etc., but also for who followed her, which was, of course, John Major. Now, John Major was a more successful politician than perhaps many people realise and served for 7 years, which is only 1 year shorter than a very successful 2-term American president. However, there is no getting around the fact that, in part thanks to how he was satirised by places like Spitting Image, for example, for those who can remember that, Major was always seen as a rather weak individual, not a strong man. He sure as hell wasn't Michael Heseltine, who, of course, had been the bête noire of Margaret Thatcher and who had famously wielded the dagger that led to her demise as Prime Minister. To put that in a very similar context in the United States history, if you think about Ronald Reagan, very much like Margaret Thatcher, who served at the same time, similar politics, similar ways in which they arguably divided the country in terms of pro and con, but he was followed by George H.W. Bush. Now, again, I think that the further you get away from George H.W. Bush's presidency, the better it looked. But at the time, he was seen as being, in the words of Newsweek, a bit of a wimp. He was seen as Reagan light. He certainly wasn't seen as being a strident, conservative giant, the like of which Ronald Reagan had become. Many Republicans simply weren't that impressed by him, which is remarkable when you consider his war record, his career of service, etc., etc. But there was something about George H.W. Bush that certainly seemed lightweight compared to Ronald Reagan, which of course in retrospect makes Reagan's presidency look all the more dynamic. Now, flash forward. Barack Obama, of course, was a 2-term Democratic president who everybody initially expected to be followed by Hillary Clinton. You would have therefore had 2 epoch-making presidents. The first male African-American president, followed in theory by the first female American president. You can make an argument that they would have been competing for history's textbooks to be written at the same time, quite frankly. The question you have to ask, therefore, is how committed was Barack Obama seriously to getting Hillary Clinton elected to succeed him? And both at the time and subsequently, I've often thought that Barack Obama simply didn't do enough to make sure that that happened. Now, that might have happened for a variety of reasons. Is it possible that Obama, like perhaps many Americans, just figured, well, this is a shoo-in. Look at the polls, Hillary can't lose, there's no way Donald Trump's going to win this, right? And therefore figured he didn't have to do that much. But I also wonder, quite frankly, whether he thought, well, if Trump gets in, boy oh boy, my presidency is going to look amazing. I'll seem even more erudite, even more impressive. My record of success in office, my ability to pass Obamacare, my ability to open relations with Cuba, my ability to negotiate the Paris climate change, for example. All these things will look more impressive because Donald Trump will come in and flounder and be a one-term president, and my time in office will be reflected upon and my successes will be reveled in. And of course, that hasn't happened. There's no doubt that Barack Obama's presidency, in the eyes of some, now looks better, but he's being erased from history. Donald Trump has come in and bit by bit has been seeking to remove all traces, it seems, of Barack Obama from the American history books. He has collapsed his deal with Cuba. He is withdrawn from the Paris climate change agreement. He is dismantling Obamacare. Quite frankly, the joke going around that was that if Barack Obama had cured cancer, Donald Trump would bring it back. Reminding me a little of the subplot in Back to the Future when Marty goes back to 1955 and he and his brother and sister start disappearing from a photograph because their place in history is being undermined by the fact that Marty's parents may or may not actually get together. And quite frankly, I think we're in a similar situation now with Barack Obama's presidency. He is being erased bit by bit from history by Donald Trump to such a degree that if Trump gets a second term, the question might well be Barack who for former students of American politics.
Barack who, or Who-Bama, if you will. Until next Monday then, this has been the American Chronicle, with music by Chris Warner. I'm Michael L. Roberts. Follow Dr. James D. Boyes on the links below. Tune in Thursday to a 10th episode extravaganza of the Voicing the World Late Night Noisecast. Good luck, now more than ever, and ever onward to you all.